I knew something was off the moment I saw the blood. It was early morning, the sun just creeping over the horizon, stretching long golden fingers across my land. I was making my usual rounds, checking the fences, making sure my rescue animals were accounted for, when I spotted it. A dark, drying smear near the tree line at the farthest edge of my property, a place where Daisy liked to wander. Daisy was a rescue deer, one of the lucky few that survived a car accident last spring. She was tagged by wildlife authorities, monitored as part of a rehabilitation effort. But to me, she was just part of the farm. She had a way of looking at you, like she understood things. I found her bedded down near my barn most nights, safe and comfortable. But that morning she wasn't there. I followed the blood trail with a growing sense of dread. It led me straight to a freshly dug patch of earth. My stomach turned as I knelt, brushing my fingers across the loose dirt. Something was buried here, something someone didn't want found. And then I saw it, a glint of metal, a GPS tracker, the kind wildlife authorities use. The tag that was once around Daisy's neck. It took me a full minute to breathe, to process. Someone had hunted her. Someone had killed her and buried her on my land, and in this town there was only one person brazen enough to pull something like this. Margaret Whitmore. She called herself the president of the Briarwood HOA, as if it were the White House and not a collection of suburban homes that backed up to farmland. Margaret ruled the community with the kind of zeal usually reserved for dictators and cult leaders. She didn't just enforce the rules, she created them, twisting bylaws and regulations to her whim, ensuring that everything, down to the color of your front door, needed her blessing. She was power-hungry, cruel, and worst of all, untouchable. Or so she thought. I stood there, fists clenched, heartbeat pounding in my ears. Margaret had gone too far this time. This wasn't a petty fine or a citation for having the wrong shade of mulch. This was illegal. I needed proof, and I knew exactly where to find it. The Briarwood HOA meetings were held at the town hall every second Tuesday of the month. Normally, they were a mix of pointless bureaucracy and Margaret issuing thinly veiled threats to anyone who dared oppose her. But this one would be different. I walked in just as she was lecturing a poor elderly couple about their unsanctioned garden gnome. Her voice, sharp and condescending, carried through the room. "It's a matter of community aesthetics," she said, giving them a tight-lipped smile. "We can't just allow these sorts of things otherwise. Where does it end?" I strode down the aisle, my boots thudding against the polished wood floor. Margaret saw me and her expression barely flickered. "Ah," she said, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Carson, how lovely of you to join us." I wasn't here for pleasantries. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Daisy's tracker, holding it up for everyone to see. "You killed my deer," I said, voice steady, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "And I have proof." A murmur spread through the crowd. Heads turned. Margaret stiffened, but only for a moment before she let out a soft, patronizing laugh. "Mr. Carson, let's not be dramatic," she said smoothly. "You can't just throw around wild accusations. Do you have any evidence?" I tossed the tracker onto the table in front of her. It clattered against the wood, loud and undeniable. This was buried with her body, on my land. A hush fell over the room. For the first time I saw something flicker across Margaret's face, something other than smugness. Panic. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by icy calculation. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "I don't know how that got there, but if there was a deer, perhaps it was a mercy. You know how these wild animals can be. They get into people's gardens, damage property. And let's not forget the rules. Wild animals should not be harbored so close to residential areas. If anything, Mr. Carson, you're the one in violation of the HOA guidelines." There it was, the deflection, the shift. She was trying to turn it on me, but I wasn't done yet. "I spoke to the wildlife authorities this morning," I said, stepping closer. You know what they told me? That Daisy's tracker went offline 3 days ago, and guess who was the last person seen near my property around that time? Silence. Margaret's fingers twitched against the edge of the table. I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough so only she could hear me. They've already opened an investigation. Her expression didn't change, but I saw it. The slight dilation in her pupils, the way she clenched her jaw just a little tighter. For the first time in her reign, Margaret Whitmore was afraid. But she wasn't the type to go down quietly. "Oh, Mr. Carson," she said, shaking her head with a condescending chuckle, "you have no idea what you've just done." And just like that, the meeting was over. She stormed out, heels clicking, her phone already in hand, probably calling her lawyer. Or worse, because Margaret didn't fight fair and I had just declared war. The first shot came the very next morning. A bright yellow violation notice was nailed to my front gate. Nailed, like some medieval decree. I yanked it down and scanned the absurd list of infractions, each one more ridiculous than the last. Failure to maintain appropriate community aesthetics. Unauthorized storage of agricultural equipment within public view. Illegally housing wild animals on residentially adjacent property, and my personal favorite, excessive rural disturbance. Excessive rural disturbance. On my own farm, Margaret wasn't trying to find me. She was trying to drown me in bureaucracy, bury me under a mountain of fabricated infractions. I clenched the paper in my fist. She wanted a battle? She was about to get one. The fines started rolling in by the afternoon. I heard the mail truck pull up, the usual light thunk of letters in the box. But when I opened it, my stomach tightened. Envelopes, dozens of them, each one stamped with the Briarwood HOA insignia. Margaret had gone for the kill. I ripped the first one open. $250 fine for failure to adhere to landscaping regulations. The next $500 fine for unsanctioned structures on the property. A third, $1,000 for willful negligence of community standards. By the time I got through them all, the total was well over $5,000. She was trying to bleed me dry. But what Margaret didn't realize was that I didn't scare easy. I stuffed the notices into a folder and drove straight to the town courthouse. HOA fines weren't legally binding unless enforced by a civil court, and I wanted every single charge on record. The clerk raised an eyebrow as I slapped the stack of papers onto the counter. "Briarwood HOA?" she asked, not even needing to. "Rid them. Margaret Whitmore." She let out a low whistle. "That woman's got half the county in here fighting her fines." That caught my attention. "Half the county?" The clerk gave me a knowing look, then lowered her voice. "You're not the first. She's been weaponizing the HOA for years. A lot of folks just pay up because they're scared of her." That only fueled my anger. I wasn't just fighting for me anymore. I was fighting for everyone she'd ever crushed. Margaret doubled down that night. A floodlight beamed onto my property from her backyard, sweeping across the barn, my house, the fields. It flickered every so often. She was watching me. Then the messages started, anonymous, but I knew exactly where they came from. "Better drop this nonsense, Carson. You won't win. Fighting the HOA is bad for business. You're making a mistake." The last one was the most chilling. Accidents happen, especially to men who stick their nose where it doesn't belong. I sat in the dark of my kitchen, the glow of my phone screen illuminating my clenched jaw. Margaret had just escalated this beyond HOA politics. This was a threat. She was getting desperate. Good. The next day, I took my fight public. I called up my friend Jenna, who ran a local news blog. I gave her the full story: Daisy, the tracker, the threats, the mountain of fabricated fines. Within hours, it was online, gaining traction. Then the community started talking. The comment section exploded with stories from other residents: fines for porch decorations, HOA mandated uniform holiday lights, a family who had to repaint their front door 3 times because Margaret didn't. Like the shade. But the real game changer was the wildlife authorities. They showed up at my farm by noon, 2 officers in official jackets asking for details. I handed over Daisy's tracker, told them about the burial site. They didn't say much, but I saw it in their eyes. This wasn't just an HOA issue anymore. Margaret had broken state law. She hit back harder than ever. 2 days later, I woke up to find my driveway blocked. A truck from a private towing company sat at the entrance, a man in an official-looking uniform standing beside it. "You've been reported for illegal vehicle storage," he said, nodding toward my farm equipment. HOA ordered removal. I laughed, a bitter, sharp laugh. "You touch anything on my property, and I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The man hesitated, glanced at his clipboard. He wasn't used to people pushing back. Behind me, neighbors gathered at their windows watching. I turned to them, raising my voice. "This is what happens when you give one person too much power. Who's next? Who's getting fined for a welcome?" "Matt!" Whispers spread. A few people stepped outside, nodding. The momentum was shifting. Margaret had overplayed her hand. Then the mistake that would end her. Late that night, I got a message from an unknown number. "Meet me behind the town library. 11 p.m. I have something you need." I hesitated. Could be a trap. Could be Margaret trying to lure me into something, but my gut told me otherwise. I pulled up at 10:55, headlights off. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Kevin Monroe, Margaret's former HOA treasurer, and he was holding a folder full of documents. "This," he said, handing it over, "is everything." I flipped through the papers, my pulse pounding. Bank transfers, emails, falsified records, evidence of fraud. Margaret hadn't just been abusing her power. She had been embezzling HOA funds for years. I looked up at Kevin, stunned. "Why are you giving this to me?" he exhaled. "Because I helped her cover it up, and I can't live with it anymore." I gripped the folder, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Margaret was done. She just didn't know it yet. By morning, I had a plan. Margaret had spent years making herself untouchable, but this time she was up against something she couldn't silence with a fine or a veiled threat. Cold, hard proof. The documents Kevin handed me weren't just damning, they were nuclear. Fraudulent expense reports, falsified invoices, unauthorized withdrawals from HOA funds, all leading back to one person. Margaret Whitmore had been robbing, her own kingdom blind. It wasn't just about the deer anymore. It was about everything. I had one shot to take her down, and I was going to make sure everyone saw it happen. The Briarwood HOA's next emergency meeting was packed. Word had spread like wildfire. Margaret was in trouble, and people wanted to see blood. She sat at the head of the room, hands folded, chin lifted high, a practiced expression of control. But I saw the tension in her fingers, the way she kept darting glances toward the door. She was nervous. She should be. I waited until the meeting was well underway before making my move. I stood up. "I have something to present to the community." Margaret barely blinked. "Mr. Carson, unless this is an actual concern and not another one of your—" I dropped the folder onto the table with a thud. Margaret stopped mid-sentence. I flipped it open, letting the pages fan out for all to see. "These," I said, "are records of financial misconduct. Years of it. Every dollar of HOA funds that went missing. It didn't just disappear. It went here." I stabbed a finger at a page showing direct bank transfers. Margaret Whitmore's personal accounts. The room erupted. Margaret snatched up the documents, eyes scanning the pages so fast they blurred. Her face paled. "You think this means anything?" she snapped, slamming them back down. "These are fabrications. Lies." Kevin stood. "No, they're not." Her head whipped toward him. "I handled the books," he said, voice shaking but steady. "I helped you cover it up, but I'm done protecting you." He turned to the crowd. "Everything he's saying is true. She's been stealing from all of you. Margaret shot to her feet. This is outrageous. You people are fools if you believe this nonsense. I pulled out my phone. That's funny, because the county auditor is already looking into it. I tapped the screen, and the Briarwood HOA's bank records subpoenaed. A collective gasp swept the room. Margaret's face twisted. She opened her mouth, no doubt to spin another lie, but this time there was no one left to believe her. People who had once feared her now saw her for what she was, a fraud, a thief, a liar. Then the real nail in the coffin. The doors burst open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. "Margaret Whitmore," one of them called out. The room went silent. Margaret's whole body went rigid. The officer held up a warrant. "You're under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and violations of state wildlife protection laws." That last one hit the hardest. Margaret turned on me, eyes wild. "You," I smiled. She lunged, actually lunged. But the officers grabbed her arms, dragging her backward. "You can't do this. I am the HOA president," she shrieked. Her former subjects didn't move to help her. They didn't speak in her defense. They just watched as she was cuffed and led out the door. Margaret was still screaming when they put her in the car, and just like that, her reign was over. In the aftermath, the Briarwood HOA collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Without Margaret's iron grip, people started pushing back. They uncovered more fraud, more illegal fines, more abuse of power. By the end of the month, the HOA had been officially dissolved. Freedom had returned to Briarwood. Margaret's house went up for sale not long after. It sat vacant for weeks. Then, when the price dropped low enough, I bought it. Not to live in. No, I had a better idea. I tore down the fences, ripped out the manicured bushes, the ones she forced the community to maintain, and in its place, I built something better. A wildlife sanctuary, named after Daisy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The house of the woman who killed my deer was now a safe haven for animals just like her. Neighbors helped, people I never thought would step up, because without Margaret's shadow looming over them, they were free to care about the things that really mattered. One evening, months later, I stood at the edge of the property, watching as a new rescued deer, another survivor, another chance, stepped carefully onto the land. Margaret's house was gone. Her power was gone. But what she had tried to destroy, that lived on, thrived. And that was justice enough.